Welcome back to the deep dive. You asked for it. We're diving into what happens Big IF. Donald Trump takes the 2024 election.
Buckle up. U.S. politics, hypothetical scenarios, always a fun combo.
Right. And the sources you sent, whoa, political shakeups, economic roller coasters. We're talking global impact, the whole shebang, like a political thriller, but with like real experts and stuff.
Exactly, not just crystal ball gazing here. Think of it this way. History's our textbook, current trends are the map. We're going to see what routes the U.S. could take.
Love that. Okay, so sources paint a second Trump victory as a political earthquake, especially for Republicans. What do you think? How would it reshape their identity?
$1 question, right?
Okay.
See, the Republican Party's been kind of split for decades. You've got the old guard, the traditional conservatives, fiscal responsibility, smaller government, that kind of thing.
The classics.
Right, but then you have this populist wing that's emerged, fueled by, I think, frustration with how things are, economic anxiety, the whole 9 yards.
And Trump tapped into that big time, didn't he? Whatever you think of his policies, he definitely shifted the playing field.
Absolutely. And our sources suggest a second Trump win, that populist wing, they might just take the wheel.
Interesting. So what does that look like in action?
Think about it. We could see a wave of candidates who adopt a similar style, similar policies. The fiery rhetoric, the focus on things like immigration, trade deals, issues that really resonate with that base.
So a ripple effect. These candidates get elected, Congress is different suddenly. It's a whole new ballgame in Washington.
Exactly. Our sources even pointed to the 2022 midterms as like a little preview. Remember those candidates who kind of echoed Trump's claims about the 2020 election? Some struggled to gain traction then. But now imagine a second Trump victory for a lot of voters. That's validation. That energy, that momentum, it could lead to a surge of, let's just say, unconventional candidates entering the scene.
And unconventional in politics, that's a wild card, right? Could be good, could be chaotic. What's the average voter supposed to make of all this, especially if they're used to a certain type of Republican Party?
$1 million question part 2. It all comes down to their values, their priorities. Some voters, they might be energized by this new direction, see it as shaking things up. But others, especially those who align with the more traditional conservatives, they might feel lost, even politically homeless,
Okay, so we've got this potential Republican identity crisis brewing. But it's not just the party, right? We're talking actual policies. Our sources say America First is poised for a comeback. What's that mean, practically speaking?
Well, America First, in his first term, meant big changes. Tariffs on Chinese goods, renegotiating NAFTA, that kind of thing.
Right. Definitely made some waves.
Our sources predict if he wins again, we could see a similar playbook. Stricter immigration laws, big focus on bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. could even mean more tension with our allies on trade.
Buckle up, it's going to be a bumpy ride, especially for certain industries. Our sources specifically mentioned fossil fuels and renewable energy as two to watch. What's the story there?
Well, Trump's stance on energy during his first term, it was pretty clear. He was all about the fossil fuels, energy independence, economic growth, that was the name of the game, rolled back environmental regulations, pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement.
So not exactly a green thumb then.
Not exactly. And knowing how he operates, it's not a stretch to think he doubles down on that strategy, which of course raises questions about what happens to renewable energy.
Yeah, what does that future look like under a second Trump administration? Is it all doom and gloom for renewables?
Well, it could create a tough environment for them, that's for sure. Think about reduced government subsidies, less emphasis on moving away from fossil fuels. It could slow down the growth of the renewable energy sector in the U.S., no doubt about it.
So potentially good news for fossil fuel companies, but maybe not so great for the planet or for renewable energy companies, right? It really makes you think about how these what-ifs have real-world consequences for everyone. And speaking of real-world consequences, let's talk about healthcare, always a hot-button issue. Our sources suggest another attempt to dismantle the Affordable Care Act could be on the table. Didn't we just go through this? Are we really going to do ACA round 2?
Healthcare was definitely a major battleground during Trump's first term, and it sounds like it could be a repeat performance this time around. Remember, even with all those attempts, Republicans couldn't fully repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, even with control of both houses of Congress.
Yeah, it felt like everyone and their mother had an opinion on that one. But say Trump wins again, would that be seen as a mandate to try again? Is there any chance a replacement plan could actually make everyone happy this time?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Healthcare is so complex, and there are very strong opinions on all sides. Our sources suggest a second Trump administration might embolden another push for repeal, but the same challenge remains finding a plan that appeals to both conservative and moderate Republicans while addressing concerns about things like pre-existing conditions and access to affordable care. It's a tough needle to thread.
It really makes you wonder if healthcare might just end up as more of a campaign talking point than something that actually gets changed. But let's move on to another big one, education. Our sources point to a potential shift toward charter schools and private institutions over public schools. What's the logic there, and what could it mean for families?
Well, it goes back to that long-running debate about school choice and what role the government should have in education. Some people believe that giving parents more options, like charter schools or vouchers for private schools, leads to better results for students overall because schools have to compete for students.
So it's like a free market approach to education.
Exactly. But of course, there's another side to this. Critics argue that taking money away from public schools could actually make inequality worse, not better. They worry that resources would be diverted from struggling schools in low-income areas, while schools in wealthier areas would benefit even more. It's a really complicated issue that hits home for families and communities across the country.
Especially if you're a parent just trying to figure out what's best for your kids, right? It really drives home the point that these hypothetical scenarios we're talking about have real-world effects on people's lives. And speaking of real-world effects, we can't ignore the potential social impact of a second Trump presidency. Our sources suggest it could mean even more tension around issues like Black Lives Matter and LGBTQ+ rights. Honestly, it feels like things are already pretty divisive. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, no doubt, the social fabric in the U.S. feels pretty fragile right now. And our sources suggest that a second Trump term could really pour gasoline on that fire. I mean, think about it. His first terms saw a resurgence of social movements and activism, but it also saw a rise in counter-protests and sometimes even violence.
And social media definitely played a role in all of that, right? The sources mention a possible resurgence of all that divisive rhetoric online. Is that something to be worried about, or is that just the world we live in now?
It's definitely something to watch, that's for sure. Social media can be amazing for giving a voice to the voiceless and getting people organized, but it's got a dark side too. We've already seen how these platforms can be weaponized to spread misinformation, incite violence, and make existing divisions even worse.
So it's like a double-edged sword, right? It can give power to people, but it can also be used to silence and harass.
Exactly. And if we see a second Trump term with all the social and political tension that could come with it, it's not hard to imagine social media becoming even more of a battleground.
Which makes you wonder, how is the average person supposed to deal with that? How do you stay informed without getting sucked into echo chambers or feeling totally overwhelmed by all the negativity? It's a lot.
It really is. It puts a lot of responsibility on each of us to be really careful about the information we consume, to seek out different viewpoints, and to try to have productive conversations, even when it's hard.
That's way easier said than done, though, right?
Oh, absolutely. But it's more important now than ever. We got to be critical thinkers and responsible digital citizens.
And speaking of navigating a tricky information landscape, we have to talk about the media in general. Trump's never been shy about his feelings on the press, and our sources predict a second term could mean an even rockier relationship between them.
It's true. Trump and the media, it was a, shall we say, contentious relationship. He constantly called any coverage he didn't like fake news, tried to discredit journalists, and often went straight to his base through Twitter or rallies, completely bypassing traditional media.
Subtlety wasn't exactly his strong suit. But what does that mean for the average person just trying to stay informed?
Well, that's the worry, right? When a president actively undermines trust in institutions like the media, it creates fertile ground for things like misinformation and propaganda to take root.
So where do we even begin to unpack that? If a second Trump term erodes public trust in the media even further, where do people turn for news? Who do they believe?
That's the million-dollar question. We're already seeing more and more partisan news outlets and social media echo chambers popping up, where people mostly encounter information that already aligns with what they already believe. That trend could definitely pick up steam in a second Trump term, making it even harder to separate fact from fiction.
And if everyone's stuck in their own little information bubble, how can we even talk about the issues that matter? It just seems like a recipe for more division and gridlock.
You're hitting on something really crucial there. A healthy democracy needs informed citizens, people who have access to accurate, unbiased information. Without that, having real discussions, finding common ground, and making smart choices as a society, well, it becomes almost impossible.
It's like we're not just voting for a president, we're voting for, like, what reality we want to live in. Wild.
Yeah, it's kind of a scary thought when you put it like that. And speaking of different realities, we got to talk about everyone's favorite, the economy. The sources you sent had some interesting predictions about how a second Trump term might shake things up.
It's like everyone's got their econ PhD all of a sudden, right? Some say stock market's going to go through the roof. Others are prepping for a full-blown recession. What's your take on all this? What should we be paying attention to?
Well, the economy, it's a fickle beast, right? A million factors at play, both here and around the world. But if we look back at Trump's first term, his big economic plays were tax cuts, deregulation, and of course those tariffs on goods from China.
Can't forget the tariffs. Those definitely ruffled some feathers. Trade wars, prices going up. Felt like we were on the edge of something big.
Exactly. And that tension, it could easily come back in a second term. If Trump goes all in on those protectionist trade policies again, global markets are going to feel it. Supply chains, consumer prices, the whole 9 yards.
So basically, if we see Trump slapping tariffs on everything, time to hit Costco, stock up on the essentials.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Hmm.
But it's definitely something to keep an eye on. On the flip side, some industries actually did well under Trump's policies. Manufacturing, for example, he promised them a comeback. And for some, it actually happened.
Right, the whole Make America Great Again message, it really resonated in certain parts of the country. But if those policies make a comeback, would those gains last, or are we just kicking the can down the road?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Problem with economic predictions is there's always something you don't see coming. What looks good on paper doesn't always pan out in reality.
Frustrating, but true. And we haven't even touched on how a second Trump term might change the U.S.'s role on the world stage. Any predictions there?
Well, if we're going by his America First playbook from his first term, we could see a more, shall we say, independent foreign policy. He might keep challenging those old alliances, focus on deals with individual countries rather than big groups, and take a more assertive stance with countries he sees as rivals.
So more tension with China, maybe questioning NATO. Sounds like things could get a lot more unpredictable globally. How do you think other countries would react to that? Would they try to work with a second-term Trump, or would we see new alliances forming?
Probably a bit of both, honestly. Some countries might see it as a chance to get ahead while the U.S. is focused elsewhere. Others might try to find common ground, build bridges, that kind of thing. And then there will be those who decide it's better to distance themselves from the U.S. and team up with other world powers.
Like a big game of global chess, everyone trying to figure out their next move. And the stakes are even higher now with climate change, potential pandemics, economic instability. Feels like the world needs to work together more than ever.
Absolutely. These are complex issues. They need everyone on board to find solutions. A more go-it-alone U.S. makes that a whole lot harder.
So much to think about, right? We've gone from political shakeups to economic what-ifs to global power plays, and that's just scratching the surface of a potential second Trump term.
We've definitely covered a lot of ground today, but that's what these deep dives are all about, right? Digging into these complex issues, questioning what we think we know, and hopefully coming away with a better understanding of the world around us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So as we wrap up this deep dive into a possible second term for Trump, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that nothing is set in stone. We could look at the trends, analyze history, play out different scenarios, but ultimately the future is what we make it. The choices we make, both individually and together, will determine what happens next.
A good reminder that we all have a part to play in shaping the future, even when it feels like things are totally out of control. So what can our listeners do to stay informed, stay engaged, and maybe, just maybe, feel a little more hopeful about what's to come?
Great question. Stay curious, get your information from diverse sources, talk to people who see things differently than you do even when it's tough. And most importantly, don't underestimate your own voice, your own actions. They matter more than you think.
Words to live by. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Huge thanks to our expert for guiding us through these murky waters today. And to you, dear listener, thanks for joining us on this wild ride. Remember, the future's not a spectator sport. Get out there and make your voice heard.